Hey everybody, it's Ed. Before we start, I've got some brand new Patreon supporters that I want to thank. Katie Wolf, Trip Starkey, Chris Svensson, Colin Cheek, and Robin Kelson. All these folks went to mountainandprairie.com/support and they signed up to be Patreon supporters. And there are a lot of different benefits that come with that, including a monthly Patreon exclusive podcast. So if you want to learn more about any of that stuff, just go to mountainandprairie.com/support. Thank you very much. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Pete McBride. If you're a longtime Mountain and Prairie listener, then you'll definitely remember Pete. He's a renowned photographer, filmmaker, and author, and he's joined me on the podcast twice before. Once to discuss his epic hike of the length of the Grand Canyon, and then to chat about his global search for silence in a very loud world. I'm glad to say he's back again, and this time we're chatting about his backyard river, the mighty Colorado, and the challenges, opportunities, and realities facing the people and wildlife that depend on it. Pete's newest book is titled The Colorado River, Chasing Water, and it features Pete's stunning photography and insightful essays, along with a foreword by Nick Palmgarden and an introduction by Kevin Fedarko. The book follows the Colorado River from its headwaters in the Rocky Mountains all the way down to the Colorado River Delta, where it peters out just before reaching the Gulf of California. I've read a lot of books about the Colorado River and water in the West, but Chasing Water opened my eyes to a number of very specific and sometimes maddening challenges facing the Colorado River Basin. The book delves into issues such as the unchecked exportation of water-intensive alfalfa to foreign countries, how dust leads to increased evaporation and water loss, as well as more optimistic topics, such as how Las Vegas has become an imperfect yet inspiring case study in responsible water conservation. But at its core, the book demonstrates Pete's deep love and respect for the Colorado River and showcases his 2 decades of dedication to telling the story of this world-famous waterway. We met up at Pete's house in Basalt, overlooking the Roaring Fork River, and talked about all things water and conservation. We started by talking about Pete's father and how his advice many years ago led Pete to shift his focus from global adventure photography to the Colorado River. We discussed the disconnect between people and their water sources, the challenge of using an over-appropriated water source to grow food for an entire country, Pete's firsthand experience observing changes in the river and surrounding landscapes, Pete's work with indigenous communities throughout the basin, and his preferences between photography, filmmaking, and writing. We also talk about some of his recent favorite books and much, much more. Be sure to check out the episode notes for a full list of everything we discussed and links to all of Pete's books. A big thanks to Pete for so graciously letting me barge into his house and hassle him with questions yet again. And thank you for listening. All right, Pete, I'm barged into your house once again. You didn't run me off. Thank you very much. You're the man. Love the book. I was thinking we met, I think it was almost exactly 6 years ago at 2018. And when we met, you had the first copy of the Grand Canyon book, like right hot off the press. Nobody had seen it. And you're prolific, man. I mean, this is the third one in 6 years. That's no joke. And I never want to say like it's your best book but it might be my favorite of all three because it's obviously beautiful, but I learned so much. And this comes from a guy who used to work in water conservation and reads too much about it and can easily get bored in it. And I felt like this book is the kind of thing that I'll find myself referencing for years to come. So I'm not trying to blow smoke, but thank you for writing it. Really good job.
Thanks for having me, Ed. And I think we did meet 6 years ago, and we went out on the river and surfed one of the waves, which we're not doing today because the river's a little more high, a little higher.
Oh, man, I thought that was high.
It was ripping, actually. Maybe I'm just getting soft. I'm proud of all the books I've done. I'm grateful I got a good publisher and good team. But for me, this is my favorite because it's got kind of my heart and soul and nearly 20 years of my work in it. And it's my backyard.
Yeah, well, and that's when I was looking at it, I was thinking just how many places you've been and how much you've seen. And I bet it was, was it kind of crazy, like going through and really just seeing the number of places that you've been in this watershed? Because I would think after a while they would all start blending together. But when you put it all into one volume like this, it's pretty mind-blowing how much you've seen in, what's that, like 2/3 of your career?
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty about half.
Yeah.
At least. And it's the most focused I've been on a subject. A lot of this is new content that I worked on very, very hard last year, both researching for the writing and captions, but trying to get unique angles and photographs. And yeah, it's a big, vast landscape, and it makes sense why this river does so much. But we don't think about it in that we often just sort of ignore our rivers.
Well, I want to talk about that, but I also want to talk about kind of going back in time to when, you've been traveling all over the world, adventure photography all over the place. And I remember in our last conversation, we talked a bit about your family. And I feel like even through all your work, talking about all these very technical issues about the Colorado River, the way I read it, something always comes through about the close relationship you have with your family, which I really admire. And then when in your house, like all these pictures, your family seems to be really just kind of like the pivot point of everything you do. And you make a big point in this book to talk about your dad's influence and how your dad's influence nearly 20 years ago kind of started you down this path that has now led to this book. So I was wondering if you could talk about how your dad kind of got you to focus in on your backyard.
It's a good question. My dad, his name's John, we call him Pablo, just turned 86.
Wow.
He's a very accomplished Super Cub pilot, single engine tail dragger, which is, I've been working on my pilot's license in a Super Cub, and I've landed on the runway where he lands, a grass strip at 8,000 feet, and it's no joke.
Those guys are wild men.
It's tricky, and he's a real community-oriented guy. Yeah, we have a very strong family, and like any family, we put fun in dysfunction. But but we're very supportive, and he was always like, "Why don't you tell some stories, here? Why do you have to always go away?" And I was on the adventure path and going to, places and doing things physically that other photographers didn't want to at the time, and I came back and I was like, wow. And I hit that age point where I started seeing my dad more as a buddy than a father. And I was like, well, I think you're right. And so I was thinking I would do, I got an assignment for one of the early National Geographic publications. It's no longer, most magazines are gone these days. And it was following my friend named John Waterman, who was paddling the Colorado River source to sea. And he wrote a book about it, which is really well done. And at the time I was following him, and I realized that I just couldn't make any new images. Everything was like another rafting shot, or I'm on the river, and it just didn't get my attention. And so I went on a couple flights with my dad, and we started taking pictures. And then I was like, wow, maybe it's this bigger landscape. So the Colorado River, as most people have probably heard, it's pretty big. It's 1,500 miles roughly. It's 7 states, ends in Mexico, so 2 countries, 40 million Americans. It's probably even gone up since that figure. The aerial perspective became a thing, and I started looking at the cost of aviation and hiring things, and realized that my father was the best partner I could have. And, he gives me a hard time most of the time, pretty much all the time in a good way, but he gave me a great price. He was like, I won't charge you for my time, but you pay for the fuel.
Nice.
And maintenance. And so we kind of did this father-son journey that's been going on. Now he's kind of helping me get my license, and we did a lot of flights together, mostly in the upper basin because single engine planes don't have, long ranges. But we went from here to Lake Powell, and then the interesting thing is I realized that his history, my father didn't grow up in the West. He grew up in Illinois, but he's been out here since the early 60s. And I started digging around in some of his old Super 8 footage and realized that he'd been doing adventures on this river for years. Before I was born, when I was a little baby, he's going on river trips, exploring trips. He went up Glen Canyon before Lake Powell fully flooded.
I heard that, yeah.
Yeah, so he went up in 1968, and in one section of this book, I actually walk basically in his long washed away, drowned footsteps in the same canyon, because when he walked it, the water was coming up. When I walked it, the water had receded and was still receding. And so I got to see what he saw. And in between that gap between whatever it was 4 years ago, so some 2019, 2020, something like that. So we're talking 50 some years. In that time, these canyons were all underwater. And so it made me realize that there's been this interesting parallel between the development of the Colorado River watershed, the amazing infrastructure that still boggles my mind, and his lifespan. And not to compare a human lifespan to the geologic time of a river, I'm just comparing it to the development and our hubris and mistakes that we've kind of played out and unfolded on this river, thinking we could control it. And as we all know, Mother Nature bats last, and she's telling us otherwise.
Well, I think it's pretty interesting to think about when you think about just the millions of years geologic time that goes into a river, particularly one like the Colorado, and then you think about a human lifespan. And, from your dad's birth until now, the unbelievable amount of changes that have happened to this river that's taken took millions of years before that to get to where it was. And then in the span of pretty much average American lifespan, this thing has just changed immensely. I mean, to the point that it doesn't even empty anymore. It dead ends.
It dead ends. Yeah. So for perspective, my father was born in 1938. They completed Hoover Dam, which built Lake Mead, the biggest dam in the world at the time, in 1935. In the 60s, mid-60s, they built Glen Canyon and created Lake Powell. Most people don't know that Lake Mead and Lake Powell are the two largest reservoirs in the United States. And now both of them are sitting well below half full, roughly 38%, which is a little bit up from 2 years ago when they hit their record lows at basically 21, 22%, which was the lowest they'd both been since those dams were built, and forcing all the hydrologists, all the dam engineers to ponder, concepts like dead pool, when you don't have enough water to actually get past the dam. And we can get into that, but it's, so this has all happened in his lifetime. We saw the highest points in like 1983 when these dams were about to brim over and flood. And now we're at this completely drastically different time. And I think an interesting point that we often forget and is symbolic of so much in today with our natural world is most people think water comes from the tap. And if you live in 7 states around the Colorado River watershed, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, Arizona, Vegas, and California, pretty much most of the water, mainly Southern California, the Imperial Valley, this water comes from the Colorado River, vast majority.
Well, that's, I think people really do not understand that. And I think about where I live in Colorado Springs, which is in the Arkansas River Basin, but 80% of the drinking water that I get from Colorado Springs Utility comes from the Colorado River Basin.
Exactly. And 90% of it in San Diego comes from this river system. 95 to 100% of it in Las Vegas comes from this river. 50% in Phoenix, 100% in Tucson, 50% of it in Denver. I ask people all the time, do you know where your water comes from? No idea. That is a river that's one of the most spectacular ones, the most beautiful, and of course, probably most engineered, loved to death rivers on the planet.
Yeah, it's one of those things, like, for me at least, as I dig into the complexity of it all, you'll learn one new thing, and then that opens up 10 new things that you know nothing about. So it's almost like, even though I've been pretty immersed in the water world, not like you, but for probably 6 years now, like really immersed in it, I think on a relative basis, I know less than I knew before because I know how much I don't know.
Me too.
But that's what makes it cool, I mean, and I think that's how you can devote such a large chunk of such a big career just to this. So when you think about this book and putting this out into the world, what are your hopes for this? Because when I look at it, it's this mix, and this is me, dumbass on the outside looking in, but it's this mix of art, like art on one side of the spectrum, and then hardcore journalism on the other, where you're really, really learning a lot of details about the inner workings of the Colorado River. And so when you think about putting this out in the world, like, what is if you even have one, what's the goal of it?
It's a great question. When I probably still struggle with all the time. But I think, for me, I've been fixated on water. I think water's our most precious resource. I say this a lot. We can live without oil, not comfortably, but we can. We have for thousands of years. We can't live without water. And yet we take water for granted. And so my goal is that, because I've been to a lot of water conferences, I hear it, and I don't ever pretend to be an expert. I'm not a water attorney. I'm not a hydrologist. And so my small brain quickly gets bored by water facts and numbers and, acre feet, this and that. I wanted to use a photographic, artistic perspective to kind of lure people in to be like, wow, this is kind of interesting, beautiful. There's beauty in even kind of the bleakest sections of the river, and then encourage them maybe to read the caption and then start to learn more, and then hopefully their awareness, like, well, I didn't know that. And wow, maybe I should be paying a little more attention to that new development that's going to go down the street and they don't have water permits, and make people a little more conscientious that, in my opinion, water is going to be the ultimate decider of not just development and not just recreation and fun, but it's agriculture, it's food, they say it's up to 12% of the U.S. GDP if you look at all the agriculture and recreation and everything and industry-based energy based around this river system. And so make people start to turn their attention back to the river. And, we keep our backs to the river kind of metaphorically so much of the time. It's just water comes from the tap. It's going to be there, but it's stressed. In my opinion, we've been tottering on this southwestern water crisis for quite some time. We're in our third decade of drought. We over-allocated the river. We put more straws in the drink than it can actually supply. We thought we had a large soda. We really have like a medium soda, but we don't want to give up our water rights. We're reluctant to. And so I want people to become kind of more aware of that concept.
One of my favorite kinds of books, and I think about Hampton Sides a lot with this, are the books that you breeze through them. They're fun. And then when you close it, you're like, oh man, now I know all this stuff I didn't even know. It's like what do they say? Like sugar makes the medicine go down or whatever. And so like, that's how I think about Blood and Thunder or Hampton's new book, The Wide, Wide Sea. And that's how I've thought about all your books, because, and it's a completely different level, because it's these beautiful images and art, and same with your films. But then when you finish, you're like, oh damn, I know a lot of stuff that I didn't know. And then also I know how much I don't know and how much more there is to learn, which I think that's the mark of a great book. Can you talk a bit about, for people who aren't holding the book in their hands, about the captions in this book? Because there's obviously a lot of, written word, but I feel like the captions are more in detail than any book I've seen like this before. And that's where a lot of the real meat is.
Yeah. So, I work with a publisher out of New York, Rizzoli, and they do beautiful art books. But they were great because they let me do long extended captions. So it's a big coffee table book, and you can flip to any section, and then you can look at the pictures and just enjoy them for the images. But then you can actually do, a 300-word caption read and learn about whatever section of the book you're in. And we broke it into basically 3 sections: mountain, desert, and delta, and then looked at it and just dive into it a little more. And for instance, I tried to talk to as many water experts as I can, people who have been working on this longer than I have, and give you little nuggets of their wisdom. Like we've heard recently about the Colorado River and the challenges, and they just fixed it. The federal government is paying farmers not to farm in the lower basin of the river, the lower half, basically. Then you talk to other experts that I have quoted in here that say, we're just putting Band-Aids on top of Band-Aids.
Is that Taylor Hollis?
That's Taylor Hollis.
Yeah, she's been on the podcast. She's awesome.
She's
awesome.
Talk
about somebody who, what a resource there.
Yeah, she's a real guru, and she's been super supportive and instrumental in my work. And so she's on the front lines of trying to do conservation around the river. And I'm just trying to give people, someone like me who is more of a visual person, the ability to understand the complexity, the beauty, the scope and scale of this river, and how, even if you don't live in these 7 states or down in the Delta region in Mexico, to understand that if you have a salad in Washington, D.C. or New York City or Boston in December or January, 95% chance that lettuce was grown with Colorado River water. So this whole country, United States, is completely connected to this system. We eat it, we rely on it, and then if you're out in the West, of course, there's plenty of recreationists and others. And then of our largest energy plant in the U.S., Palo Verde Nuclear Station south of Phoenix, is completely cooled by Colorado River water, recycled. Most people, I didn't know that when I started this project, and how that relates to the water levels at Hoover Dam and Lake Powell. And if they get too low, they have to have the ability to jumpstart this nuclear power plant if for whatever reason it gets shut down. And it's completely connected to this electrical power grid that is built around this system. And these are the little nuggets you kind of pick up. And I've picked up and had fun and many challenges trying to document.
One of the nuggets that stuck out, I mean, I've got a whole page here of bullet points of different nuggets, but one that I'd heard about, but I've never talked to anybody in detail about, and it's just shocking when you really think about it. I think it was talking about alfalfa and alfalfa production and how much water goes to agriculture, and then how much of a large percentage of that water goes to just growing alfalfa, much of which doesn't even stay on U.S. soil. Could you just give an overview of that story? Because I can't believe that's legal.
I couldn't either when I dug into this. So for those unfamiliar with the river, it's divided in an upper and lower basin, basically split down the middle of each basin gets 7.5 million acre feet. Yep. When they originally wrote what's called the Law of the River of 1922. And then Mexico gets another 1.5 million acre feet. That adds up to 16.5 million acre feet. Here I am talking about numbers, and I said I didn't like numbers. But for the math wonks, there you go. The river on average is flowing less than 13 million acre feet. So we're pulling out more, and we're getting forced into paying people not to use water. We're getting forced into using percentage bases instead of hard numbers. But in the lower basin, roughly I've heard up to more than half, and it's maybe changing as we speak, goes to agriculture. And yes, we need food, and we're going to need to grow our vegetables. But the big cash crop down in the lower basin where it's hot and you can grow 12 months of the year is we're putting that water into alfalfa. And the reason is alfalfa is a very, very high protein rich forage crop for cattle. So yes, for those that love to eat beef in the U.S., they may think, well, that's great. But most of that water is going to alfalfa that's getting exported. It's getting basically grown, stacked, packed, and shipped into Amazon shipping containers and sent overseas to mostly Saudi Arabia and Asia for them to produce cattle, dairy, even racehorses. And you could say, well, that's just free market. But we've put no restriction on this, so they realize we're loose with our water, and now farmers are just going to grow the highest cash crop they can. And we're not talking about 1 or 2 or 3 cuttings of alfalfa a year. We're talking like 10 to 13.
Just year round.
Just year round. And so we're exporting our water, our very limited, precious water from the Southwest where everyone's scrambling to get it. We're exporting the vast majority of it, overseas. So the saying is water flows uphill to money. Well, now it flows uphill and also overseas in shipping containers in the form of forage crops. And some people may have a hard time. So how's that water? Well, alfalfa is hugely water intensive to grow it. So we're just flooding, these alfalfa fields, cutting it, baling it, packing it, and starting the process over. Meanwhile, communities and so forth trying to grow, and maybe smart or not smart. That can be, that's part of the big discussion here. What's going to be smart growth with water? But while people are straining in one area, we're being very reckless and loose and sort of abundance-based ag usage that isn't staying in the U.S.
Yeah, and you can't blame the farmers at all, because, you think about what a hard job that is. And I used to deal a lot with farmers, and really, no matter how successful your business is, how many generations you've been doing it, every spring or at the beginning of every fiscal year, your ass is on the line. And if things don't go well, and it's a low margin business, and so you can't fault farmers, I don't think, for individual farmers for wanting to sell and make money for their family. But that seems like the kind of thing that is a perfect example. It'd be hard to argue that government regulation would be a good thing there.
And it's a good point. And we often think ag, mom and pop farm, American dream. But what I'm talking about is not those farmers.
Yeah, these mega.
I'm talking
deals.
about mega agribusiness. And many of them are actually the farms and the facilities and these giant packing, stacking, shipping facilities are owned by Saudi Arabia.
I forgot about, yeah. When I think about farming, my frame of reference is Pueblo County, which is a lot of multi-generational small businesses. And this is a completely different deal.
This is a completely different animal. And people are coming to wake up on this. And it's not just the river. We're diverting a lot of water from the river. All American Canal carries 4 million acre feet generally to a lot of these farms, but it's also drilling for groundwater. So beneath these river systems are all these kind of subterraneous river systems that supports our groundwater. And they're drilling 900, 1,000 feet for water unregulated. The more money they have, the deeper they can drill, which puts out of business a lot of the mom and pop farms in the neighborhood.
Got it. They're like kind of forced to sell and be sucked in by the big guy, I guess.
And so Arizona has actually put a limit. They've revoked a lot of permits for this, for non-national farmers. And so they're raising some awareness on that. And I think that's critical. I think there should be a minimum, some sort of agricultural forage export fee. I mean, if you were a small hay farmer, alfalfa farmer, they're buying tons of hay for, 3x of the average hay price.
Wow.
So it's mind-boggling, and it puts it in perspective how there is a lot of water in this system. We're not managing it that well. Even in these drought situations, a lot of municipalities are doing a great job and encouraging people to use less and so forth. At the same time, we're being excessive and wasteful with these giant ag businesses that aren't even U.S. based.
I remember years and years ago, it's probably 12 years ago now, I was in the real estate business and selling ranches, and there was a lot of interest in Utah from Chinese buyers just buying alfalfa ground. That's all they wanted. They wanted ground that grew alfalfa that had a lot of water on it. And that was, 12 years ago. And it just kind of struck me as a curious thing. Like, you're going to fly alfalfa across the world, put it on a shipping container? But
sure
we
enough.
are.
But a lot of those shipping containers, they come over full of our plastic junk that we all think we need, and they go back empty, or they were. Mm-hmm. Now they're going back with alfalfa.
That's wild, man. Where do you see that going? Like, if you had to predict, looking out 10 years, I mean, do you think that there's going to be, it sounds like Arizona's doing something about it. It just seems like such a simple thing that just requires education. But it's like when I talked to Chris Tompkins, she said, well, the government couldn't get a dog park passed these days, So even simple stuff seems to be a fight.
I think we're in tricky times. We're divided, and the old saying, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. Well, it's playing out here too. But I honestly think we could do some simple strides, whether it's driven by the states in the basin to come together around this, or it ends up being the federal government that steps in. But just saying, we cannot be trying to protect and conserve a river system and a watershed on one hand and being so unrestricted on the other hand with this kind of export business.
Another part of the book, and then I'll quit pestering you about all the bullet points I have here, but that I found very interesting that I didn't know anything about. I knew a little bit about it, but was dust on the snow and how that affects the quantity of water in the river. I knew a bit about it, and then I feel like you're uniquely qualified to talk about that because if I remember correctly, you were just up skiing down a 14er recently and seeing it firsthand. Can you talk about that factoid?
I grew up in Colorado, and I grew up on the western slope up in the Rocky Mountains, and I've been a skier my whole life, been privileged to be able to do a lot of skiing. And every spring, my brother or friends, and we'll skin up peaks. We put skins on our skis and we hike up, and then we ski down these beautiful peaks because it's less avalanche risk in the springtime. So we get the first front lines look at the watershed because this river really originates at the top. And over the years, I've always done it. And I imagine I have these visions of like going up and skiing, beautiful high peaks and, 13,000, 14,000 foot peaks. Some are a little technical and spicy, but usually fun. And I always envision that this beautiful blanket of white snow in the spring, and you're looking down on the green, lush valleys below, and you're really getting kind of the big picture. But over the last decade, amazingly, we go up and the snow is brown. And the reason is there's so much increased development to the southwest of us, housing developments, roads, and they're disrupting a lot of the fragile desert landscapes, that the dust is blowing up into the atmosphere. And then when we get these late spring storms, often snow storms, wet snowstorms, it snows brown. And so not only does it change that kind of that postcard look of Colorado with the white peaks, making them all brown, but it affects the water too. Yeah. So the dust holds the sun's temperature, melts off the snow faster, and then of course plant life starts sipping sooner, called transevaporation process, starts earlier. And so we're losing about 5% of the river's flow to this dust on snow phenomenon. And so you mentioned I just recently went up North Maroon Peak, which is right at the headwaters of Maroon Creek, one of the tributaries that goes into the Roaring Fork. It's kind of the postcard peak, and we were able to ski down the north face, which is sort of a fun, interesting ski.
Fun.
Type 2 fun. We leave at 2 in the morning and you hike all night, and then you ski just in the morning before it gets too soft. And this last spring, to my amazement, because we'd had a recent storm before that, it was white, and it was like, wow, this is just spectacular. And I was spectacularly exhausted, but really inspirational and beautiful to be able to do that. But when we were going up, I remember noticing that right below that white layer was that layer of dust, and it was like you'd slide it away and you would just see the brown layer there. And just 2 weeks after we skied it, that white layer melted off, everything went brown again, and the snow just has this kind of rust color, desert color to it. And then immediately our rivers have started like hitting high water at a rate that I haven't seen in a long time. So it's just coming off so quickly.
Because it just absorbs the solar energy faster.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And so now what's really, I think, hard for hydrologists to predict is you may have a snowpack. Say this year we were around 96%, which was pretty good. We've been much, much lower recently. And that was above 9,000 feet. Where I live in Basalt, I never had snow in my yard last a week. I used to have 2 feet. So you combine this kind of changing snow patterns with this fast runoff, and it's really hard to predict, how much is Lake Powell going to fill up? How much is Lake Mead going to fill up? Because the average snowpack doesn't translate to the average runoff anymore. And so that's adding to this big mix of how much water's in this system and how can we parcel it out equitably and work with everybody and keep water in the river for the river itself, which the river, of course, doesn't really have many rights when you get, especially towards the end. And so I think this book showcases a lot of that too, because this newer pattern we have with a more volatile climate is it's either flood or drought, and that's having a big hand. And the other lesson is that this isn't just an issue downstream. This is an issue that's rippling all the way to the very tip top of the watershed at 14,000 feet.
Yeah, that volatility, no matter what, I feel like volatility is always a sign that things are haywire. If it was just drought or if it was just too much snow, you could kind of get your head around that. The scientists could predict it. But I feel like it's like in 2008 when the stock market was getting ready, it starts up, down, and you're like, oh, here we go.
Yeah.
And that volatility is unnerving, to say the least.
Yeah, it's unnerving. And so this issue isn't going away. And that's why I think, more awareness and just checking in, where does your water come from? Just simple question, people to think about. And then hopefully they'll start to engage a little more and think about it in a way that they haven't.
On the flip side of that, a positive thing that your book woke me up to that I'd heard bits about, but I'd never dug into the details, is Las Vegas. And when I think about Las Vegas, I think about those fountains in front of the casinos, just shooting water in there, and just kind of from the outside looking in, it looks like excess, which is what Las Vegas is known for. However, they're kind of the poster child for how to do this, in the right way and figure out how to make money and have a thriving economy while also decreasing water use. Can you talk about Vegas?
Yeah, so Vegas, while I've been working on this river system, when they divvied up this river on paper in 1922 and parceled it out to all 7 states and said, this is what you get and this is what you get, Vegas hardly existed. So Vegas is boomed up around their kind of excess and decadent model, oases in the desert. And so from afar, yeah, it looks very wasteful, and it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. There's plenty of waste in many of our states and areas. But they've learned to stretch a drop further than most people because they didn't have the water. They had to. And they've also realized how expensive it is to maintain what limited water supply they have. For instance, they get their water from Lake Mead, and they had what was called the first straw. And there's images of this first straw, which is now 400 feet from the banks of Lake Mead because the reservoir has receded so much. So then they built a second straw during this project. And in that time, that straw went defunct, and then they spent nearly $1 billion to bore a pipeline, underneath, basically a drain underneath Lake Mead, and that's called the third straw. And so plenty of people will say, well, water's free and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, maybe free if you are near it, but it's the access to water which is becoming so expensive. And so they've learned kind of through the challenges that they're faced through the drought and not being given very much water rights, that they have to find ways to be more efficient. And I've heard many water managers say that their best reservoir of water is conservation. And so they pay people to tear out their very thirsty, Kentucky bluegrass front lawns and smartscape it or xeriscape it. They put in desert-friendly, less thirsty crops. And that actually originated in Denver, actually, smartscaping. So not pouring all your fresh water onto your front yard, which we all that's part of the, the American dream. And so they've found ways to do that and still make it look beautified and make it look elegant. And then they recycle gray water, which is showers and sinks. They clean it and they use it in most of their swimming pools. They've tried to curtail golfing. Golfing, of course, pours a lot on for that beautiful manicured greens, but they're putting restrictions on that. That could be a whole other debate there, of course. But they've been on the front lines of this more than most. Phoenix, they're doing in pockets, but they still consume a lot. And then Tucson, on the other hand, they're at the very end of a 336-mile canal from the Colorado River called the Central Arizona Project, where they get 100% of their water. And they've been very proactive in staying ahead of this problem by banking their water into the groundwater underneath Tucson. And a lot of people said early on they were crazy, but it's proven to be very successful. And they have more control of their own kind of municipal water use and how to do it wisely. Contamination is a whole other issue in addition to this. But there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes of where we put water, how we save it, how we use it. Are we trying to close our systems? Closed water system is where you use it not just once and flush it down the river or down wherever, but you capture it and reuse it again. You clean it and realize that it is that limited. And there's a lot of models where that's proven very effective in some of these Southwest cities.
There was a note I made when I was reading it, and it said that, correct me if this is wrong, but that by the time the water makes its way all the way through, or as far as it's going to go, it's been reused 17 times. I've heard
between 15 and 17 times. Kevin Fedarko, a dear friend of mine who wrote one of the introduction essays, who uses the power of his pen. Yeah. He's a great writer. He talks about that. And a lot of that isn't just reusing it from your tap back into your own tap. It's putting it back into the water table, which trickles down to a tributary, it trickles back to the Colorado River, which goes into another canal, which goes onto another farm field, gets back to another canal, to another farm field. And the interesting thing there is when you get down to the U.S.-Mexican border, where it's been used roughly 17 times for all these natural kind of recapture systems with the water table, you have very saline water, very salty. It's picked up salts from the soils, minerals, contaminants, a lot of things. So it's not maybe the water we'd like to think it is. It's pretty contaminated. And so in Mexico, which used to be the big famous delta at the end of this river, which I didn't know about when I started this project many years ago, that Aldo Leopold took a canoe down in 1922 and described this delta as being so vast and so beautiful that he, quote, the river was nowhere and everywhere. Like he couldn't decide which way to paddle to get to the sea because it was sort of this lush oases. He described so much wildlife that there was leopards and cottonwood forests, and at moments there was so much bird life that it would turn the skies black. And I've been down there a lot, and that delta, sadly, is no more than really cracked earth, kind of dried wasteland, minus a few little pockets of conservation, thanks to a lot of people trying to keep this concept of the delta alive, not just for us, but for the biodiversity and the bird life that depends on this, because this is a huge flyaway zone, kind of a stopping point, will you say. It's kind of like all these birds that travel and insects that travel from the south to the north and back every year. They have to go through this pinch point. It's like the pinch point of an hourglass, and that pinch point is the Colorado River Delta. And so there's very, very, very little left of it down there. And so restoring little pockets of it down there is critically important for us, because a lot of these natural migrations of birds and insects sustain the agriculture, which also depends on this river too, and keeps the crops actually growing so you don't have huge disease or the wrong type of insect, eating everything away. It keeps things in check, and it kind of sustains us. Ultimately, it's like the immune system for our natural food production.
Is that the same area where you described moving through in some sort of boat or paddleboard as Frappuccino Lake? Is that the same
that's
area?
my affectionate term for the end of the river.
It's perfect because I'd heard you say that, like just when I was listening to an interview or something, and then you actually see the photo in the book, and that's exactly what it looks like. I mean, it's a perfect description.
So I refer to one, and I have an image in the book, which is an older image, and it was when I actually was with John Waterman when he was finishing his journey. I got in a pack raft with him, and we were going to paddle the Delta or as much as we could. I didn't really know how much there would be, and to my amazement at the time, and it was, for me in many ways, it was what pivoted me to make this more of a life's work. The river turned into this frothy, kind of yucky, tannin-filled, plastic bottle-filled, murky, partially sewage, who knows what, Frappuccino pit, as I affectionately call it. And that was just 2 miles into Mexico. So what was the largest desert estuary in North America fizzled into this gunk pit just 2 miles across the border. And I was like, what the hell is going on? Like, I didn't know. Like, why did I not know this? So part of this book and staying with this project for so long is that I'm just trying to make people like refocus on the things that are, in my opinion, more important than social media likes or, the latest sports scores. And all that's, has its value on a certain level, but this is really is the lifeline. Water is life, which is cliche, but that's where the Frappuccino pit comes from. But there's other images of variations of the Frappuccino pit because it constantly changes. Sometimes it's a mile into Mexico, sometimes it makes it 2.5 miles, and I've seen it where you just see this mighty Colorado River, the architect of the Grand Canyon, and all these national parks, 10 national parks in the Southwest, turn into like what looks like you just poured a glass of dirty water into the sand, and you're like, what is going on here?
It is. It's really crazy because I feel like I'm pretty well plugged into so much of this, and then you see it. And so that's one of the things I love about this book is I don't have to go paddle through the Frappuccino. Like I get the end result and kind of the punch in the face and the wake up call by looking at your book. And I think that's where the real power is. When you think about books versus films, because you've done very well at both, how do you think about how you want to spend your time? Like as far as putting stuff into the world that is going to catch people's attention? Because I mean, I feel like you could devote your time fully to either, but you kind of jump back and forth.
That's a good question. I think I started as a photographer, and actually I started originally as a writer. I don't have the chops as someone like a Kevin Fedarko or a Nick Palmgarten, who wrote an essay. He's a New Yorker writer who wrote a beautiful essay for this book. I don't have the chops with the words that they do, but I do like pairing images with my writing as best I can. So that's kind of where my origins start. But I've moved into film because it's a more nuanced, layered story, and we live in a world of video is a good way to get people's attention. I think I'll probably keep trying to do both. What I like about books is they have a shelf life that you'd like to think, at least I would, that last. It's they may not have the reach of if you had an award-winning national film, but documentaries are tough to get that kind of reach. But a book may not have that kind of reach, but I think it'll stick around for a while. And, I think I'll probably keep trying to do both, maybe because I'm more, I have a wide swath. I have a lot of tools in my tool belt, and I'm not a master of any in some ways. So,
and a lot of energy.
And so I just keep using all the tools at my access that maybe I could be better at one or the other, but...
It's going to work out for you, I think.
I don't know. I'm no Hampton or Fedarko, but
well, I mean, I think that's one of the things that I've ever since we first met is like you're very self-deprecating, and like even I always read the acknowledgments in books and like the dedications and all that. I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to that stuff, but in everything you write and do, you're so quick to give the credit to other people, and I think that just shows a humility, a curiosity, and then also like a humility, like, look, I don't know all this stuff and I'm learning it every day. I don't know. I think it's a great model to put these things into the world, because nobody wants to be preached to or just yelled at. And again, with this book, it's beautiful and it's positive, but it doesn't shy away from the negative stuff. But after you finish this thing, you're not going to be like, oh, we're screwed. What's the point? There's hope in it, I think. Earned hope.
Yeah, good. That's a term I picked up from somebody you interviewed recently, Chris Tompkins.
Yeah, that's what we talked about that. Yeah. I never had thought about that. And
I like earned hope.
She really zoned in on that, and a lot of people on social media made little clips of that specific line. And I'd never thought about it that way, but it's true.
Yeah, and I mean, my interpretation, my understanding of earned hope is hope with action. Don't just hashtag hope and hope something's going to happen. Go out and do something. Be a storyteller. Do what you can. Be a voice in your local community. Protect local area and in your region. Ask questions. Why are we going to grow at this level if we don't have the resources that we would need to do this? Mainly water. Yeah, I think, and there is hope in this. There's plenty of reasons to scratch our head and be like, how am I ever going to make a difference? This is bleak. We've dried up what I would argue is one of the most iconic rivers in the planet, which has one of the greatest canyons on the planet, the Grand Canyon, which I've actually spoken. I had the privilege to get a tour and speak to some of the astronauts on the space station that confirmed with me that that's one of the only canyons you can clearly see from outer space.
Wow.
And of course, that's this river. That's 277 miles of this river in the middle. And then I've also seen images that those same astronauts shared with me that they took from the space station, where you can see the delta and you can see this amazing patchwork of green farmland and then a vast like brown spot that used to be amazing kind of wild estuary that is drizzled to nothing. But back to the hope side, there's a lot of people behind the scenes working on this, trying to give the river itself a voice. We often are always arguing about the small nuances of, well, we need water for this and energy and agriculture, et cetera, and municipalities and industry. But there's not many people stepping up to be a voice for the river, and that the river should actually have a little water in the river itself for all the systems it's evolved with it and supported for so long. And so there's little pockets of conservation throughout the river corridor, but also at the delta. And I've been to them and I've seen them actually thrive with a little bit of water. We're talking like less than 1%, fractions of the river system. They do these little pulse flows that these conservationists have been working on to restore sections of the river. Having seen them and been part of it, I've actually paddled the river. Back in 2014, they did one pulse flow where it went the whole delta. They didn't even use irrigation canals, which they're using now because there's less. But so we were able to paddle the river all the way to the end, which is really amazing. I use the word paddle lightly because a lot of times we were dragging our paddle boards and bushwhacking in 6 inches of water. But we got to see the river connect to the sea and what the conservation can do for this river itself. And what was so amazing to me was seeing this wetlands come back to life on a certain degree, but it was hearing the orchestra, the symphony of nature bounce right back to life. The ecological memory kind of be like, oh, water. Here we go. We're going to have like crustaceans come right back to life that have been waiting patiently 20 years in the sand. Birds suddenly start chirping and coyotes start howling and fish are suddenly swimming in the river. You're like, wow, how did this happen so quickly? And so Mother Nature has this resiliency that is pretty amazing. It takes political will to do it. And what was interesting on a couple levels there is when we paddled the river to the end, which was now 10 years ago, crazy to me to think this river flowed to the sea for 6 million years. It completely dried up and stopped reaching the ocean in the late 90s. And then they did this pulse flow in 2014, and that was the last natural connection. And so we became the last three people, the three of us that paddled it and dragged our paddle boards. We became the last humans to paddle this river to the sea. For the non-boaters in the world, that made me like, well, so what? But for people that, like myself, who grew up with the thought that rivers flow to the sea, this was symbolic on so many levels. And I say, sadly, we live in a world of we're the first to do that. Well, we were the last to do this on the river, and that kind of hits me with a sadness. But I see the constant ongoing efforts of people trying to redo that. They did a pulse flow a couple of years ago that they used irrigation canals to supplement it, but they were able to do it. And there's people trying to give that voice back to the river. And so there is these pockets of hope throughout this, and people are trying to, myself included, raise that voice.
Well, I feel like in all of your work, both film and print, you spend a lot of time immersing yourself in the perspective of the native tribes that, I think 30 tribes in the
30.
Colorado River Basin. And I feel like in this book, you really highlight some of the efforts they're making and the efforts they're making, and then also the ridiculous challenges they're facing given how much water they actually own, yet they're still being mistreated, in my opinion. How important is that to you? I mean, it's obviously important, but can you just talk a bit about why you spend so much time on the ground in these native communities, making sure that their voice is heard? Because I think that's so important and hasn't been done for a long time. And I feel like you've been doing it for quite a while.
I did it in part because when we last spoke, we spoke about this walk I did with Kevin Fedarko, and he just came out with a new book. I don't know if I haven't
read it yet. I need to.
Well, you'll enjoy it, and you should talk to him.
I want to.
That's called A Walk in the Park, and he does an amazing job of elevating their voice. But when we did this walk, we spent over a year walking 800 miles through the Grand Canyon. And every day we had to find water because we weren't near the river because the cliffs are too sheer. And so we got up in kind of the hinterlands of the wilderness areas, so to speak, of Grand Canyon, sometimes 3,000 feet from the river. And so we had to find our allotted gallon of water that we needed to survive per person per day. And the native communities were the ones that were constantly telling us to listen to the canyon, listen. And at first I was like, what are they talking about? And over time, I started realizing that there was a lot of lessons to be learned by kind of becoming more aware and listening to all the signs around us. And it ranged from just listening to insects. If we could hear, the buzz of an insect, which over time our hearing got better on this walk, we knew we were getting closer to water, or the bleat of sheep, because sheep have to be near water too. And so I realized that they have a real connection to this system far more than we do. And we've, of course, ignored their voice. And they have, I think it's 20%, if not more, 25% allocated of water of this river system on paper. Of course, they have a fraction of that in reality, and they're fighting to get their appropriate treaty-written access. And so that's a big card in this whole how we remanage this river system and how we come to a more improved law of the river that is coming up in 2026. How are we going to make this system not just be a Band-Aid on a Band-Aid, but more of a solution that's long-lasting? Just in the Grand Canyon, there's 11 Native American tribal communities that live around the Grand Canyon, which I spent a lot of time with interacting. But the Navajo is one of them. They have a 17 million acre reservation, the largest in the United States. And they have river systems, tributaries, huge tributaries, one of the longest, the Little Colorado, flowing through the reservation. And they have the San Juan. And so trying to understand how they play a hand in this is critically important. They've been turned down by the Supreme Court on a long-standing battle to get water that they had allotted in paper, but they've also put up other fights to protect water. There's been an ongoing battle of the Little Colorado River where they proposed to build dams, an ongoing thing, and that was recently finally kind of overturned because they were moving forward to build dams without having the consent or the voice of the Navajo people involved in the decision-making. And that decision just came down that said they have to include their voice in these decisions. And so it pushed that challenge back to the shelf somewhere. It'll probably reappear like it does in all these conservation stories. But just getting a grasp of how much land and how much they're a part of this system, I think, is critically important.
Definitely. And I have a partnership with the Nature Conservancy highlighting a lot of their work. And we've talked in great detail about some of that between talking with Taylor and then some of their other folks who are doing really impressive work. But it's almost like the alfalfa thing. When you hear it, you're like, what? It's 2024. Like, what the hell is going on here? I know, maybe I'm just a dumbass, but it's like, I'm kind of cynical thanks to my years in the real estate business, and it still surprises me.
Well, I mean, we're a selfish species. But I'll give you a cool story of how Native voices have played a hand and how I've seen them, and I've been following their stories. There was a story of a tram proposal to build a $1 billion tram into the Grand Canyon on Navajo land, right to the border of the Grand Canyon National Park. And thanks to the hard work of basically 12 Navajo grandmothers, only 4 of them spoke English, they were able to push that back and win a huge vote in the Navajo Tribal Council, a vote of 16-2, to prevent that from going forward. That would have been a huge challenge on water alone, obviously pressure on the canyon. And then most recently, when I was working on this Grand Canyon project years ago, I photographed a small band of Havasupai Native Americans who were protesting in front of a uranium mine. This uranium mine sits just a few hundred yards from the Grand Canyon National Park boundary on public land. And this mine is active. It actually just started pulling uranium out of the ground. And it goes down some 2,000, 3,000 feet and has hit groundwater in and around the Grand Canyon. Now that groundwater, again, it's these subterranean river systems we don't fully understand. They're flowing in directions we can't fully comprehend. They're starting to learn that by putting blue dye and radioisotopes in the water and measuring where they appear. Yep. And they often appear not just downstream, but upstream in really unpredicted springs. And so I photographed this young this small band of Havasupai. And one of them at the time was named Maya Talusi. She was, I think, age 9. And I remember making these photographs, and one of the images became the opening spread of this National Geographic story. And they were concerned about contamination of water that flows into their drinking supply at Havasu Creek, which is, of course, a tributary to the Colorado and part of all that drinking water downstream for 40 million. I was thinking to myself, well, this is great, and I'm so impressed and moved by these communities that are saying so strong and dedicated to trying to preserve this limited resource that most of us aren't paying attention to. But I was like, really, how is this going to make any change? And this last August, so roughly a year ago, they amazingly made a new national monument, Ancestral Footprints of Grand Canyon National Park, where they protected about 1 million acres of land around the Grand Canyon National Park to prevent from future uranium mining. The current mines were grandfathered in, so that was the compromise. But at the center, at the heart of this new monument, was the 2 people that I focused on when I photographed Carletta Toulouse, the mother of Maya. Maya now age 19, and she introduced the president when they announced this national monument.
Wow.
So I watched a 9-year-old go from protesting and doing traditional dances, thinking to myself, what difference can we make? And I watched a 9-year-old young little Havasupai leader go on to introduce a president of the United States to announce a new national monument. And of course, everything's political today and divided, but to see how that voice has risen, it represented not just a small family of one Native community working with a larger coalition of other Native communities to create this bigger voice to protect and conserve not just land and sacred sites, but the health and longevity of our natural water system. And so I think that's why the Native voice is becoming ever more prominent and important.
I love that, man. Well, I think that's a good high point to end on. I just really appreciate you taking the time, obviously, but all your work is greatly enriched my life and my understanding of all this. And then I'm sure it has to all the folks that listen. I'm always asking about book recommendations. You got any good ones? Anything you're reading now? I know one you're reading.
I just finished one, which I already mentioned, which is Kevin's book, which made the New York Times bestseller list right out of the gates. And I may be biased because I'm part of the book. I was part of the journey, but I had nothing to do with Kevin's genius of writing. Anyway, his book does a remarkable deep dive, not just on our adventure, but on really the history of Native voices and how they've been neglected and what lessons we can learn from them.
I'm excited to read that. Yeah, that book's been a long time coming. I've been very excited about it. I'm glad it's getting all the recognition it deserves. Great writer and a really, really good dude. I've only hung out with him once, that time with you in Santa Fe, but what a good guy, man. I'm so happy for him.
Yeah.
And y'all are quite the pair.
Yeah. And I'm in the middle of Hampton Side's new book too, which is, Hampton's for both Kevin and I, he's a role model.
Yeah. And another funny, great dude on top of it. All right. You're the man, dude. Thank you. Very good to see you. Very good to hang out, and keep up the good work, my man.
Always. Thanks, Ed. You're the man yourself.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.